everyone. Welcome to the Hard Answers. I'm Tom Graham. Government finances are complex at best and completely misleading at worst. What's the biggest problem with government finances? Promises of unfunded future benefits. Instead of current salary raises, promises of more retirement benefits. Promises of insurance payments without actuarially sound underwriting. The list goes on and on. Promises of things that cost money without securing the money to fulfill those promises has gotten us into all kinds of trouble. We have states like California and Illinois, and cities like Detroit, Chicago, Philadelphia, and New York, and many others, who have promised generous retirement benefits for their employees without funding those promises. They either have no intention of keeping these promises, or the person making the promises knew that they wouldn't be around when the bill came due, so they felt free to promise anything they wanted just to make the unions happy. We are now seeing major cities trying to claim bankruptcy, and soon Illinois and California may as well. Promising future benefits without setting aside real assets, not fictitious assets, and I'll get back to that in a minute, is a time-tested recipe for disaster. Social Security. Our Social Security program has a very large fictitious asset called the Social Security Trust Fund. This is debt held in a fund that the American people owes to the American people, and listed on the budget sheets as intragovernmental debt. In other words, debt that the government owes itself, which for most applications is ignored. It's like writing yourself an IOU, putting it in your sock drawer, and considering that money in the bank because you're good for it. Social Security payments are always paid out of the current year's revenues, and any money that is collected through Social Security taxes that is not used for this year's benefits is paid to the general fund to purchase more fictitious debt for the trust fund. Once in the general fund, the extra money is used for anything the government currently needs. This is one of the biggest shell game frauds perpetrated on the American people today. Instead of buying gold or setting aside money in an IRA for each contributor, it assumes that when the Social Security Administration needs to sell the debt in the fund, that there will be buyers and that the taxpayers will be able to afford the interest being paid on the bonds once the bonds in the trust fund are sold. Even if there are buyers for the $2.8 trillion in debt, the Social Security Administration projects that the trust fund will be exhausted in 2037. That's only 20 years from today. The Social Security Board of Trustees projects that changes equivalent to an immediate reduction in benefits of about 13%, or an immediate increase in the combined payroll rate from 12.4% to 14.4%, or some combination of these changes, would be sufficient to allow a full payment for the scheduled benefit for the next 75 years. The bottom line is, if you're under 70, don't count on Social Security to be there at the current expected benefit levels. A realistic expectation is to expect 75% of the current promised benefit to be there for you, so plan accordingly. The debt. Due to overspending on everything from defense to social programs, NASA to education, foreign help, foreign contributions, all of it, our current debt is over $20.5 trillion at an average short-term interest rate of 2.3%, about $471 billion per year in interest. So how did we get here? That's pretty easy. We spent more than we took in. We promised too much. Since 1929, receipts have averaged about 15% of GDP, while outlays averaged 18% of GDP. Since 1980, though, receipts averaged about 17.1% of GDP and outlays about 20.3% of GDP. We keep raising taxes to catch up to spending, but we keep raising spending at the same time. We have a spending problem, and the only way to fix a problem is to first admit that you have a problem. Then there is the unexpected downtimes, the stock market crash of 1929, the Depression, World War II in 1945, the recessions and other wars, the tragedies that impact the GDP negatively, but make us spend more because of them, like the housing bubble. This is why governments of the past used to maintain something called a war chest. And many homes today still have a rainy day fund, assets or money set aside to be used in case of an emergency so you don't get into trouble with too much debt. Our government has completely given up on this concept and instead relies on the public to purchase bonds whenever it gets itself in trouble and needs more money for something unexpected. These two reasons, spending too much on planned items combined with unexpected events and not having a war chest or a rainy day fund, are why we are in the situation we're in. Poor planning and spending too much. We currently have a national debt of over 20.5 trillion. Of course, 5.6 trillion of that is money we owe to ourselves, that intragovernmental loan stuff. So in reality, the debt is closer to 14.9 trillion, but that's still a lot of debt. Consider this. The federal revenue for 2016 was $3.2 trillion, and the debt without the phony debt is $14.9 trillion, or the government's yearly salary times about 4.65. If you took home $50,000 per year, to have an equivalent debt, your debt including everything, house, cars, credit card, would be $230,000. At 3% for 30 years, that's about $970 a month, or about 23% of your budget just to pay off your debt in the next 30 years. Spending. So what do we spend our money on? Mostly social programs. In 2016, we spent 25.93% of our national budget on Social Security elderly benefits, 20.72% on welfare, including Medicaid, 14.37% on Medicare. These three items account for over 61% of the national budget. An additional 7.69% went to interest on the debt. This keeps going up, and it's estimated to be over 20% by 2040. Of course, we pay the minimum monthly payment, so we never actually pay the debt down. 21.63% on defense. This keeps going down and is estimated to be less than 9% by 2040. Other spending includes $108 billion on education, college grants to individuals, grants to K-12 colleges and universities, $91.8 billion in transportation, roads using gasoline taxes, $63.9 billion on other spending, $52.4 billion on general government spending, $41.5 billion on police and firefighter spending, $33 billion on health research. Altogether, the federal budget was $4 trillion in 2017. Moving on to taxes. How much is fair? In fiscal year 2017, which ended September 30th, the individual income tax was expected to bring in nearly $1.66 trillion, or about 48% of all federal revenues, according to the Office of Management and Budget. The corporate income tax was estimated to raise another $324 billion, or 9% of the total federal revenue. The rest of the federal revenue comes from a mix of sources including Social Security and Medicare payroll taxes, excise taxes such as those on alcohol and gasoline, unemployment insurance taxes, customs duties, and estate taxes. Spending that's not covered by all these taxes is paid for by borrowing. Taxpayers with incomes of $200,000 or more paid well over half, 58.8% of federal income taxes, though they accounted for only 4.5% of all returns filed. People making between $100,000 and $200,000 actually paid the highest share of all taxes paid, 21.7% of all federal income taxes. But they had a 12.7% effective tax rate, well below the 19.4% rate paid by people making between $200,000 and $500,000. Also less than half of the effective rate paid by those two income groups above $500,000. Taxpayers with incomes below $30,000 filed nearly 44% of all returns, but paid just 1.4% of all federal income tax. In fact, 2/3 of the nearly 66 million returns filed by those people in the lowest income tier owed no tax at all. On average, taxpayers making less than $30,000 paid an effective rate of 4.9% in 2015, compared with 9.2% for those making between $50,000 and under $100,000, and 27.5% for those incomes of $2 million or more. The top 1% pays more in income taxes than the bottom 40%. But most people forget the corollary to this, and that is, how much value and benefits do the income tax payers get? Let's look at the 2015 household quintiles as defined by the IRS. Turns out that the bottom 20% get an average of $667 in benefits, but only pay an average of $98, so they get nearly 7 times as much benefit as they pay in. The next quintile gets an average of $568 in benefits, but only pays in an average of $219, so they get almost 3 times as much as they pay back in. The next quintile gets an average of $475 in benefits, but only pays an average of $379. Still, they're coming out slightly ahead. The next quintile gets an average of $434 in benefits and pays in an average of $657. These are the first to actually suffer a loss by paying taxes. They get 66% of their money back in benefits, but contribute 34% to paying for the lowest 3 quintiles. The top quintile gets an average of $494 in benefits and pays in an average of $1,602. They get about 30% of their money back in benefits and contribute 70% to paying for the lowest 3 quintiles benefits. More than $1.6 trillion of wealth is transferred from the top 2 quintiles to the bottom 3 quintiles in this fashion each year. Is that fair? Is that progressive? Is that liberal? If so, I think you have some strange definitions for those words. What solutions are there for this out-of-control spending? Can't the government just print more money? No, the government can't print money. I'll explain to you why this is not possible in another video covering the Federal Reserve and another video covering Bitcoin. Basically, what it comes down to is that the only way the government can create more money is by creating more debt and hoping that there are buyers willing to buy it. So why don't we just create more debt? Well, the more debt you have, the harder it is to borrow, and the higher the interest rate you have to borrow at, because your credit score goes down every time you borrow more. This is true for individuals, corporations, and governments. If you have little debt, you can borrow at 3%. If you have lots of debt, you have to borrow at 10%. The vicious interest cycle. Because the more you borrow, the more interest accrues on the money you've borrowed, which leaves you less of your revenue to spend on mandatory spending, which means you need to borrow so you can spend that mandatory spending, but then you owe more in interest, leaving you even less next year to spend on that mandatory spending, and the cycle continues. When the government borrows, it issues bonds that are sold to individuals or organizations as investments, and the government pays interest on the debt to them. The people who purchase the bonds get richer for buying them. When the government spends the borrowed money, 2/3 of the money is spent on social programs, the big 3 being Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security elderly benefits, so the deficit spending makes the poor and elderly richer. Considering the majority of the rich are the elderly, and the majority of insurance program dollars are spent in the last 3 years of the elderly's life, deficit spending is enriching the elderly rich far more than anyone else, followed by the poor. The top IRS quintile is 80% comprised of the middle class, and they are paying a large portion of the money used to pay the interest on the debt. None of the lower 3 quintiles are paying anything for interest on the debt because they get all their money back in benefits the top quintiles pay for. So the bottom line is, because it makes the rich richer, and destroys the middle class. That's why we can't borrow more money. So is there any good news? Yes, in fact there is. The Federal Reserve Bank over the last decade has painted itself into a corner. Back in the days of the recession of 2008, it started paying interest on excess reserves while doing quantitative easing in order to stimulate the economy and at the same time not expand the money supply to have runaway inflation. The end result is that we now have incredibly low interest rates for borrowing from banks, so businesses are expanding and the real estate market is booming. Also due to this, the government is paying incredibly low interest rates on U.S. bonds, allowing it to borrow twice as much as it could at typical interest rates, which historically hovered around 6%, but now are around 3%. If the Fed raises interest rates too fast, it risks member banks putting those excess reserves, about $2.8 trillion, into the economy, where fractional multiplication will expand the money supply tenfold and create out-of-control inflation. Raising the interest rates will also raise the interest on the bonds that the U.S. has sold to the public, which means more of the budget would have to be paid in interest. So for the next decade, the Fed will be limited to raising interest rates between 0.25 and 0.5% per year until it gets up to about 6%, or the excess reserves have depleted so they can stop paying interest on them. So the next 10 years of economic activity in the U.S. is going to be incredible. And because of the recent real estate bubble, there's just enough fear in place to keep the real estate prices in check. Now is the time to get into growth funds because the growth is not stopping for the foreseeable future. And the new corporate tax rate of 21% has the German finance ministry predicting that $42 billion of manufacturing will be coming back to the U.S. from Germany alone. Other countries with corporate tax rates above 21% are also worried. We are experiencing low inflation, low interest rates, good growth, low unemployment, moderate workforce participation, so if we need more labor, we can get it from Americans. So the labor costs are low to moderate. We are enforcing immigration law and putting American workers first. This economy might be strong enough to raise the GDP faster than the rise of spending and might actually produce a surplus that can be used to pay down the debt incurred over the last decade before we have to refinance it at higher interest rates. It truly is a magnificent time in economic history, and I certainly hope the members of Congress won't waste the opportunity of a country's lifetime to be one of the only countries in modern history to pay its debt down by 50% or more in the next decade while becoming the most powerful sustained economy on the planet. The president is ready to sign those spending cuts if Congress would just get them on his desk. Please click the subscribe button to see more videos like this. If you disagree with me, please leave a comment. My ears are always open and I learn new things every day when people disagree with me. I'm Tom Graham. I'll see you next time on The Hard Answers.